Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Kalen felt the grit of Xylos in his teeth, in the folds of his skin, in the weary marrow of his bones. It was a planet of fine, abrasive dust that promised to grind down mountains and men with equal indifference. He stood on the Ferrocrete landing pad, the twin suns, one a searing white giant, the other a sullen red dwarf, baking the air into a shimmering haze. Around him, the prefabricated habdomes and processing plants of Imperial Extraction Site 734 squatted low against the horizon, their metallic hides scarred by the last shard storm. They were temporary things, built to last a decade at most, long enough to bleed the planet dry and move on. He knew. He had built them. He was an engineer, once. A combat engineer with the 12th Imperial Legion, erecting fortifications on worlds that screamed under orbital fire. He had raised bastions that withstood plasma scourges and kinetic strikes, structures meant to preserve the Empire's brutal advance. Now, his title was Maintenance Technician, Grade 3. His job was to patch the atmospheric seals on the domes, recalibrate the nutrient paste dispensers, and ensure the containment fields held. It was a long fall from building monuments to war, but Kalen preferred the quiet anonymity of fixing what was already broken. It felt more honest. The other workers, rough-faced men and women with desperation etched around their eyes, boasted of their survival. They would gather in the grimy mess hall, nursing mugs of cheap synthale, trading stories of the great shard storms. They spoke of the keening wind that sounded like a dying god, of crystalline splinters the size of a man's arm hitting the domes like artillery. They wore their proximity to death like a badge of honor. Kalen never joined them. He had seen real death, the kind that came from focused particle beams and deliberate, methodical slaughter. A storm was just weather. It had no malice. The Empire, on the other hand, was built of it. His current assignment was the one nobody wanted. Sector Gamma, the Biosciences Containment Wing. It was a sterile, white-walled block at the far edge of the facility, isolated by triple-layered blast doors and its own dedicated power grid. Inside was the specimen, the sole surviving Xylan, captured during the initial planetary survey. The survey team's report had been brief and violent. It described a silicon-based life form of immense hostility and power, a mindless crystalline predator. They called it Specimen 7, or more colloquially, the Shard Witch. Kalen's job was to monitor the integrity of its electromagnetic cage. He walked the silent corridors of Sector Gamma, his boots echoing in the unnerving quiet. The air was cold, recycled to a clinical purity that smelled of nothing. He passed rows of empty labs, the project having been deemed a failure. The creature refused to cooperate, refused to be studied, and its biology was too alien for their instruments to properly analyze. It was now just a prisoner, a monster in a box, kept alive out of a mixture of scientific stubbornness and bureaucratic inertia. He reached the central observation chamber, a thick plasteel window, crisscrossed with energy-conductive filaments, looked down into a sunken circular pit. In the center of the pit, the Xylan floated. It was a being of breathtaking, terrifying beauty. Its form was vaguely humanoid, a slender shape composed of interlocking, semi-translucent crystals that shifted and changed color with a slow, internal light. It was not one solid thing, but a shimmering, cohesive swarm of countless smaller facets, held together by a force he could not comprehend. Hues of amethyst, quartz, and obsidian flowed through its body like a slow tide. For containment, pylons hummed at the edge of the pit, projecting the shimmering, blue-white cage of energy that held it in place. The official reports said it was dangerous. Kalen looked at the being, designated Lyra by some forgotten scientist with a sense of poetry, and saw only exhaustion. The light within its crystalline form was dim, its movements sluggish. It drifted listlessly within the cage, never touching the energy barrier, as if it had learned the painful lesson long ago. He had seen the same look in the eyes of captured partisans on a dozen worlds. It was the look of a spirit being systematically crushed. The Empire was good at that. His console blinked, a soft amber warning. Field fluctuation, pylon delta. His job was simple. Reroute auxiliary power, stabilize the field, file the report. Protocol was clear. Any deviation, any sign of containment failure, was to be met with maximum force. He was to flood the chamber with a dampening frequency that would, according to the manual, render the specimen inert. The word they used was inert, but Kalen knew it meant shatter. He placed his hand on the console, his fingers hovering over the stabilization controls. He looked down at Lyra. Her inner light flickered weakly. On a whim, a stupid, inexplicable impulse, he bypassed the standard diagnostics and ran a deep spectrum analysis of the creature itself. The readings that scrolled across his screen were not the chaotic energy signatures of a wild beast. They were complex, rhythmic, a language of light and frequency, weak but coherent. It was a song of pain. Another alarm blared, this one a sharp, insistent red. Critical power failure, main grid. The lights in the corridor flickered and died, replaced by the stark, crimson glow of the emergency backup. On his console, the containment field schematic began to flash. 3 of the 4 pylons went dark. The blue-white cage dissolved into nothing. For a moment, Lyra remained motionless, as if she could not believe it. Then, slowly, she drifted downward, her crystalline feet touching the floor of the pit for what was likely the first time in years. Her light pulsed, brighter now, but still fragile. Protocol screamed in his head. Hit the alarm. Activate the countermeasures. Save yourself. He looked from the panic-inducing red button on his console to the creature below. He saw the way its multifaceted limbs trembled. The reports said it fed on geological energy, on rare silicates and resonant crystals found deep within the planet's crust. It had been starving. He turned away from the console and moved to a nearby supply locker. His access codes opened it with a hiss. Inside were geological survey samples, core drills stored in sterile containers. He found what he was looking for, a perfect, fist-sized crystal of pure, refined quartz, used for calibrating the deep scan sensors. It was worthless junk to the Empire now, a forgotten piece of equipment. To her, it might be life. He did not know why he did it. Maybe it was a flicker of defiance against the crushing, soulless weight of the Empire he had served and come to despise. Maybe he was just tired of watching things break. He pried open the container, the crystal cool and heavy in his palm. He walked to the edge of the observation window, found the emergency release for the specimen access port, a small hatch used for robotic arms to collect samples. He keyed it open. He leaned through, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Here," he whispered, the sound swallowed by the hum of the emergency power. He did not know if she could understand. He tossed the quartz crystal down into the pit. It landed with a soft clink on the ferrocrete floor. Lyra turned her featureless, crystalline head toward it. She drifted closer, her form shimmering with uncertainty. She extended a slender, faceted hand, the tips of her fingers hovering just over the crystal. Then she touched it. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. A wave of blinding white light erupted from her, a silent explosion that threw Kalen back from the window. The entire facility shuddered as if struck by an earthquake. Alarms shrieked to life across the compound, a cacophony of sirens that signaled a total system failure. The emergency lights died, plunging him into absolute darkness. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, a sound that vibrated not in his ears, but in his chest, in his teeth. It was the sound of the planet waking up. He had not offered a piece of food. He had lit a fuse. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the pulsing, amethyst glow emanating from the pit below. The hum intensified, a resonant frequency that made the very structure of the containment wing groan in protest. Kalen pushed himself to his feet, his ears ringing. He had expected a reaction, perhaps a minor energy discharge. He had not anticipated this. It felt as though he had plugged a planetary power grid into a dying battery. The entire compound was in chaos. He could hear the distant, panicked shouts of the other workers and the metallic clang of blast doors slamming shut. They would think it was an attack, a catastrophic malfunction. They would be here in minutes. He scrambled back to the observation window. Lyra was no longer a dim, flickering candle. She was a star. Light poured from her, not in a chaotic burst, but in controlled, cohesive waves. The quartz crystal was gone, absorbed into her form, and the change was profound. She stood taller, her crystalline structure now sharp and defined, flowing with vibrant, deep purples and blues. She looked up, not at the window, but directly at him, and for the first time, he felt a distinct sense of intelligent observation. There was no malice in it, but there was an unnerving power. The emergency comms crackled to life on his console, a voice thick with static and fear. All personnel, Sector Gamma is compromised. Repeat, the specimen is loose. Defense teams converge. Lethal force is authorized. Lethal force. They would come with plasma repeaters and concussion grenades. They would not try to contain her. They would try to shatter her into a million pieces. The thought settled in his gut like a cold stone. He had started this. He had given her the strength to break free, and now he was about to watch her be executed for it. The old, familiar weight of complicity settled on his shoulders. He had followed orders his whole life, building the cages and fortresses that enabled the Empire's cruelty. For once, he had acted on his own, and the result was the same: more death. Unless he did something else. The decision was not born of courage or morality. It was a simple, pragmatic calculation. He was in the compromised sector. The blast doors were sealed. When the defense teams arrived, they would not be asking questions. They would neutralize the target and anyone standing next to it. He was already a dead man. The only choice left was how he would meet the end. He ran from the observation room, down the short corridor to the pit's main access hatch. It was a heavy, shielded door designed to withstand incredible force. His high-level engineering codes, a relic of his former life that he had never bothered to have rescinded, flashed green. The door hissed open. The resonant hum washed over him, a physical pressure against his skin. The air was thick with ozone and the strange, clean scent of energized crystal. Lyra stood in the center of the pit, her light bathing the circular room in a soft, violet glow. She turned her head as he entered, her form perfectly still. He had no weapon, only the multi-tool on his belt. He felt ridiculously, suicidally exposed. He held up his empty hands, a gesture he hoped was universal enough. "They are coming," he said, his voice loud in the humming silence. "They will kill you." She did not respond in any way he could understand, but the light within her pulsed in a steady, rhythmic beat. A low, grinding sound came from above. She tilted her head, and Kalen followed her gaze. The ceiling of the pit, a solid plate of reinforced durasteel, was beginning to buckle inward. They were trying to crush the room. He had to get them out. "This way," he said, more to himself than to her. He ran to a maintenance panel on the far wall, ripping it open with his multi-tool. Behind it was a nexus of conduits and power lines. His mind, honed by years of battlefield engineering, saw not a tangled mess, but a schematic. He knew the layout of this facility better than the man who had designed it. There was a service tunnel, designed for waste reclamation, running directly beneath them. It was their only chance. He began to work, his hands moving with an old, familiar certainty. He rerouted power from the failing life support systems, channeling it into the magnetic lock of the floor hatch beneath their feet. Sparks flew from the panel, and the smell of burning insulation filled the air. The grinding from the ceiling grew louder, the metal screaming as it deformed. Dust and debris rained down. Lyra drifted toward him, silent and watchful. She did not seem afraid. As a large chunk of ferrocrete broke loose from the ceiling and tumbled toward him, she raised a hand. A shield of shimmering, translucent energy, like flawed glass, materialized in the air above him, deflecting the debris with a sharp crack. It shattered on impact, but it had saved him. He stared at her for a second, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He was trying to save her life, and she had just saved his. With a final, violent surge of power, the magnetic lock on the floor hatch gave way. A heavy clang echoed through the room as the meter-thick plate dropped open, revealing a dark, cavernous tunnel below. A foul, chemical stench rose from the darkness. "Go," he yelled, pointing down. "Now." She hesitated for only a moment, then drifted over the opening and descended into the blackness, her violet light shrinking until it was just a distant star. Kalen scrambled after her, just as the ceiling above gave way completely. A torrent of twisted metal and shattered concrete crashed down into the pit, filling the space where they had been standing seconds before. He pulled the heavy emergency release, and the maintenance hatch slammed shut above them, sealing them in the dark, stinking tunnel. They were out of the prison. They were now fugitives, buried deep beneath the surface of a hostile world, with the entire Imperial garrison hunting them. The tunnel was a claustrophobic tube of corroded metal and slick, chemical residue. It smelled of industrial solvents and decay. Lyra's light was their only guide, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the curved walls. They moved in silence, the only sounds the soft, almost inaudible chime of her crystalline form and the squelch of his boots in the grime. Distrust was a tangible thing between them. He was one of the creatures who had caged her, and she was an unknown power that had nearly brought a mountain of steel down on his head. But they were bound by the shared threat that hunted them from above. Faint vibrations traveled through the floor, the rhythmic thud of heavy machinery and the distant crump of detonations. The garrison was tearing Sector Gamma apart, looking for them. Kalen led them deeper into the labyrinthine network of service tunnels, relying on a mental map of the facility's underbelly. He was not just running. He was thinking like an engineer. He needed to put distance between them and their pursuers, but more importantly, he needed to find a way to the surface that was not crawling with soldiers. They came to a junction, a wider chamber where several tunnels converged. He paused, trying to get his bearings. As he did, a section of the wall to his left exploded inward in a shower of rust and molten metal. A trio of Imperial sentry drones, sleek, spider-like machines with glowing red optical sensors, scuttled into the tunnel, their mounted pulse rifles swiveling to lock onto them. There was no time to react. Kalen threw himself to the side, but he knew he was too slow. The high-pitched whine of charging capacitors filled the air. Before the drones could fire, Lyra moved. She swept past him, a flowing river of light and crystal. She did not attack them. She simply raised her hands, and the floor of the tunnel beneath the drones turned to liquid. The corroded metal plating dissolved as if it were sand, and the three machines plunged into the slurry of industrial waste below with a shriek of grinding gears and shorting circuits. The floor then hardened again, as solid as it had been before. He stared, breathless, at the spot where the drones had been. She had not destroyed them. She had simply asked the ground to swallow them. Her power was not a weapon. It was a fundamental command over the very material of the world around her. He looked at her, and the fear he felt was now mingled with a profound sense of awe. They pressed on, Kalen now acutely aware of how much he depended on her. His knowledge of the facility was their map, but her power was their shield. Hours bled into one another in the suffocating darkness. They finally emerged into a massive, cavernous space at the edge of the compound, the primary or processing bay. It was a cathedral of industry, filled with colossal grinding machines and conveyor belts, all silent and still in the emergency shutdown. High above, a series of blast shields covered what would be their exit, the main exhaust port, large enough to drive a cargo hauler through. Getting to it would be a challenge. The bay was a maze of gantries and platforms. As they began to climb, a voice echoed through the vast space, amplified by the facility's public address system. Kalen, this is Commander Valerius. You cannot escape. The facility is sealed. Surrender the specimen, and you will be treated fairly. Kalen froze on the gantry. He knew that voice. Commander Valerius was not a man known for fairness. He was known for pacifying entire continents with orbital bombardments. He was the architect of the Empire's most brutal campaigns, a man who saw people, planets, and entire species as entries on a resource ledger. The creature is a danger to this entire operation, Kalen. The voice continued, smooth and reasonable. You were a good soldier once. You understand the necessity of sacrifice for the greater good. Do not throw your life away for a monster. The greater good. The Empire's good. Kalen looked at Lyra, who had paused beside him, her light dimming as if in response to the commander's voice. A monster. He had thought that, too. But the being beside him had saved his life twice, had shown more control and precision in her power than 1,000 of the Empire's brutish soldiers. He did not reply. There was no point. Valerius was not negotiating. He was stalling, triangulating their position. Sure enough, floodlights snapped on, bathing their gantry in a harsh, white glare. From the far side of the bay, a squad of Imperial troopers in black carapace armor advanced, their rifles raised. There, Kalen said, pointing up toward the exhaust port. We have to go. They scrambled up the last series of ladders. Plasma bolts began to stitch the air around them, impacting the metal struts with explosive force. Kalen felt a searing heat across his back as a near miss melted a section of the railing beside him. They reached the final platform, directly beneath the massive, sealed port. A control panel was set into the wall, but it was dead, the power cut. "I can't open it from here," he yelled over the sound of weapons fire. Lyra moved to the blast shield. She placed her crystalline palms flat against the cold, thick durasteel. Her internal light flared, an intense, burning white. The hum returned, louder than ever, shaking the entire platform. The metal of the blast shield began to glow cherry red where she touched it. With a groan of protesting metal, the central locking mechanism, a solid meter of forged alloy, began to melt. It dripped down like wax, pooling on the floor. The troopers were closing in, advancing steadily up the gantries. Kalen found a heavy industrial wrench lying on the platform and stood between them and Lyra, a pathetic, useless guardian. It was a futile gesture, but it was all he had. With a final, deafening screech, a section of the blast shield tore open, revealing the bruised, purple sky of Xylos and the storm-racked plains beyond. A howling wind whipped into the bay, carrying with it the sharp, stinging grit of the planet's surface. "Go," he shouted to her. She turned from the opening, her light softening. She drifted toward him, and for a terrifying moment, he thought she was going to leave him behind. Instead, she wrapped a cool, crystalline arm around his waist, lifting him off his feet as easily as if he were a child. She launched them through the jagged hole in the wall, out into the raging wind of the plains. Below them, the troopers could only watch as they flew out into the heart of the brewing shard storm. It was not an escape. It was a leap from one cage into a much larger, deadlier one. The shard storm was a living entity. The wind did not just blow, it screamed, a high-pitched, abrasive cry that vibrated through Kalen's skull. Shards of black, volcanic glass, some as small as needles, others the size of daggers, flew horizontally through the air, propelled by the gale. They struck his fatigues with sharp, stinging impacts, tearing the fabric. Lyra's body shielded him from the worst of it, her crystalline form seeming to part the storm around them, but even she was buffeted by the immense force of the wind. They flew low over a landscape of cracked, gray earth and jagged rock formations that looked like broken teeth. The Imperial facility quickly vanished behind them, swallowed by the swirling dust and razor-sharp rain. There was no destination, only flight. Kalen clung to her, the cold of her body seeping through his clothes, a stark contrast to the searing friction of the wind. He was completely at her mercy, a passenger in a tempest, carried by a being he barely understood. After what felt like an eternity, she descended into the relative shelter of a deep canyon, its high walls providing a respite from the main force of the storm. She set him down gently on a wide ledge of dark rock. He stumbled, his legs weak, and leaned against the canyon wall, gasping for air that felt like it was full of ground glass. The roar of the storm was now a muffled howl from above. Lyra drifted a short distance away, her light pulsing erratically. He could see now that the storm had taken a toll on her as well. Her form was dimmer, and there were small fractures and chips on her crystalline surface, like a statue that had been sandblasted. She had protected him, but it had cost her. They were stranded. They had escaped the facility, but they were in the middle of a lethal wilderness, during the worst kind of storm the planet had to offer, with no food, no water, and no shelter. And they were being hunted. The initial elation of escape curdled into the grim reality of their situation. For days, they journeyed through the desolate wastes of Xylos. The storm abated, leaving behind a sky the color of a fresh bruise and a landscape blanketed in a fine layer of black, crystalline dust. They traveled by night, hiding during the day when the twin suns made the surface unbearably hot and the threat of Imperial search patrols was highest. Kalen's military survival training kicked in. He found brackish water seeping from rock fissures and identified edible, if foul-tasting, lichens growing in the shaded parts of the canyons. It was a meager existence, but it kept him alive. Lyra did not seem to need food or water. She drew her energy from the planet itself. At night, she would find veins of quartz or other minerals in the rock and place her hands upon them. Her light would brighten as she drew sustenance from the earth, the faint hum of her body a constant, quiet presence in the darkness. Their communication remained unspoken. It was a language of gestures and shared experience. He learned to read the subtle shifts in the color and intensity of her light. A soft, blue glow meant calm or curiosity. A sharp, violet pulse meant danger. A dim, gray flickering meant she was weak. In turn, she seemed to understand his physical limitations, slowing her pace when he grew tired, finding shelter when she sensed his fatigue. They were a strange pair, a creature of pure energy and earth, and a man of flesh and bone, both broken in their own ways, both running from the same machine. One evening, as they rested in a shallow cave, she did something new. She floated before him and raised her hands. The light from her palms coalesced, not into a shield, but into a series of shifting, three-dimensional images that hung in the air between them. It was a vision, a story told in light. He saw the world of Xylos not as a barren rock, but as a vibrant, interconnected whole. He saw vast networks of crystal running beneath the planet's crust, like a nervous system. He saw the Xylans, dozens of them, not as individuals, but as nodes in that network, living in silent, harmonious communion with the planet. They were not its inhabitants, they were its consciousness. The planet itself was alive, a slow, geological intelligence, and the Xylans were its senses, its children, its mind. Then the vision soured. He saw the Imperial ships arrive, great metal spears falling from the sky. He saw the miners, the colossal drills. He saw a great, metal spike, the main drill from Site 734, plunging deep into the planet's crust, aimed at a point of immense luminescence at its very center. The planet's core, its heart. The drill was not just mining. It was a stake being driven into a living being. The pain was psychic, a silent scream that echoed through the entire crystalline network. The shard storms, he realized, were not a meteorological phenomenon. They were a fever, a planetary immune response to an invasive infection. The planet was trying to fight back, to purge the poison from its body. And it was dying. Lyra was not just the last of her kind. She was the last fragment of a shattered consciousness, trying desperately to hold on. The vision faded, leaving Kalen in the dim light of the cave, the weight of this new truth pressing down on him. The Empire was not just strip mining a desolate rock. It was committing deicide. It was murdering a god for profit. Commander Valerius was not just a ruthless officer. He was the executioner of a world. And Kalen had been his tool. Every structure he had built, every fortification he had raised, had been another nail in the coffin. The next day, as they were navigating a narrow, treacherous pass, an Imperial reconnaissance drone crested a nearby ridge. It was a new model, faster and better armed than the sentries in the tunnel. It spotted them instantly, a piercing shriek of an alarm cutting through the quiet air. Lyra reacted immediately, pulling Kalen behind a rock outcropping as the drone opened fire with a rapid pulse laser. Beams of scarlet energy impacted the rock, showering them with superheated fragments. One of the fragments caught Kalen in the thigh, a sharp, searing pain that made him cry out. He fell to the ground, his legs suddenly useless. The drone swooped lower, preparing for another pass. Lyra moved out from behind the cover. She raised her hands, and a dozen massive spires of black rock erupted from the canyon floor, thrusting upward like angry spears. The drone, caught by surprise, tried to swerve, but it was too late. One of the spires impaled it through its central chassis, and it fell from the sky with a screech of tortured metal, crashing to the ground in a ball of fire and smoke. The immediate danger was gone, but Kalen was badly injured. He looked down at his leg. A wicked gash, black and cauterized at the edges by the heat, was bleeding sluggishly. He tried to stand, but the pain was blinding. He was a liability. He was slowing her down. "You should go," he grunted, the words tasting like ash. "Leave me. They know where we are now. They'll send more." Lyra floated over to him. She looked at his wound, then at him. Her light softened to a gentle, healing green. She knelt beside him and placed her cool, crystalline fingers on the edges of the wound. He flinched, expecting pain, but instead a soothing coolness spread through his leg, dulling the fire. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. He watched in amazement as the tissues seemed to knit themselves together under her touch. It would not heal the wound completely, but it would be enough. As she worked, her sleeve of coalesced light shifted, and he saw her arm. It was covered in a network of fine, dark lines, like cracks in a crystal vase. They were scars. He realized they were burns, patterns left by the containment field that had been her prison for so long. They were a map of her own private torment, etched onto her very being. He looked at the fresh scar on his own leg, then at the ancient scars she bore. In that moment, in the silence of the canyon, a bond was forged that transcended words. It was a shared understanding of pain, of being wounded by the same uncaring machine. He was no longer just her protector, and she was no longer just his savior. They were allies. They were survivors. And they were going to fight back. The drone's destruction had given away their position. Kalen knew they had, at most, a few hours before Imperial ground forces arrived. His leg was numb and stiff, but Lyra's intervention had made it possible for him to move. They had to keep going, but their flight felt increasingly futile. Xylos was a big planet, but it was not big enough to hide from the orbital surveillance of an Imperial fleet. Their grim flight was interrupted by the appearance of a single, heavily armored transport descending from the clouds. It was not a standard troop carrier. It was smaller, sleeker, and painted a stark, menacing black. It landed in the canyon ahead of them, its ramp lowering to disgorge a squad of elite soldiers. They were Imperial commandos, the best and most ruthless troops the Empire could field. And leading them was a man Kalen recognized with a sickening jolt. It was Lieutenant Bohr, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty. Kalen had served under him briefly, years ago, and remembered him as a zealot, a true believer in the Empire's divine right to rule. He saw Kalen not just as a traitor, but as a heretic. Bohr's face, visible through his helmet's retracted visor, was set in a grim, determined sneer. Kalen, Bohr's voice, tinny and amplified, echoed off the canyon walls. You have led us on quite a chase. The commander is most displeased. Surrender the asset, and I might be convinced to grant you a quick death. There was no escape. They were trapped, with Bohr's squad in front of them and the canyon walls hemming them in. Kalen drew the heavy wrench from his belt, the only weapon he had. It was a laughable defense against men armed with assault blasters. Lyra moved in front of him, a shimmering shield of defiance. The commandos raised their weapons, the barrels glinting in the dim light. The standoff was tense, a moment stretched to its breaking point. Then, the ground began to tremble. It started as a low rumble and grew into a violent shudder that sent loose rocks tumbling down the canyon walls. A new voice, deeper and more powerful than Bohr's, boomed from the transport's external speakers. It was Commander Valerius. Lieutenant Bohr, withdraw your unit. The asset is no longer your concern. Orbital Command has authorized planetary fracturing protocol. We are ending this now. A cold dread washed over Kalen, far colder than the fear of Bohr and his men. Planetary fracturing. It was a scorched earth tactic of last resort. The Imperial fleet in orbit would use their primary cannons, not to bombard the surface, but to fire massive, earth-penetrating lances of energy deep into the planet's crust. They would shatter the tectonic plates, exposing the core and all the resources around it in one brutal, world-killing act. They had given up on capturing Lyra or mining the planet carefully. They were simply going to break it open like an egg. Bohr looked up at the sky, his sneer replaced by a look of shock, and then of manic glee. He was being denied his kill, but he was about to witness destruction on a scale few ever saw. He gave Kalen one last look of pure hatred, then motioned for his men to fall back to the transport. It seems your pet monster has just doomed its entire world, he spat, before the ramp closed and the ship lifted off, leaving them alone in the trembling canyon. The stakes had just been raised from a desperate fight for survival to an unwinnable war against a fleet of starships. They could not fight a fleet. They could not outrun orbital bombardment. Lyra's vision flashed in Kalen's mind, the luminous, beating heart of the planet, and the drill aimed right at it. The fracturing protocol would be the final, fatal blow. He looked at Lyra. Her light was pulsing with a frantic, desperate energy. She seemed to be in agony, feeling the planet's terror as its own. She turned to him, and once again, She projected a vision into his mind. It was not a memory this time, but a plan. A desperate, final gamble. She showed him the core chamber, the vast cavern at the heart of the world that the Imperial drill was targeting. She showed him how her energy, her very life force, could be focused and amplified there, creating a resonant shield that could encompass the entire planet. A shield strong enough to repel the fleet's energy lances. But she could not do it alone. Her power was organic, intuitive, chaotic. To create a stable, permanent shield, it needed a regulator. It needed a logic-based consciousness to act as a focus, a control system to shape the raw energy into an impenetrable barrier. The vision showed him a fusion, a synthesis of her crystalline, energy-based being and a complex, organic mind. It showed a human consciousness being woven into the very fabric of the shield, becoming its living CPU. The choice was presented to him not in words, but in a clear, terrifying image. To save Xylos, someone had to become a permanent, living part of it. A ghost in the machine. A prisoner for eternity, holding the walls of the world up through sheer force of will. The vision ended. The ground continued to shake. High above, the bruised sky was beginning to glow as the Imperial fleet moved into firing position. They had minutes, maybe an hour at most. The impossible choice hung in the air between them, as heavy and as solid as the rock beneath their feet. He had to decide whether to sacrifice his life, his freedom, his very identity, for a world that was not his. The weight of the choice was a physical thing, pressing down on Kalen, making it hard to breathe. He was an engineer, a builder. His entire life had been about structure, logic, and tangible things. The solution Lyra presented was something else entirely. It was metaphysics. It was transcendence. It was an end to the man named Kalen. He would not die, not in the conventional sense. He would be subsumed, his consciousness becoming the eternal, unwavering governor of a planetary defense system. He would become a machine made of flesh and light. He looked out from the canyon at the vast, alien landscape of Xylos. For weeks, it had been his prison, a hostile wilderness he had to endure. But now, seeing it through the lens of Lyra's revelation, he saw something else. He saw the subtle beauty in the jagged rock formations, the tenacity of the lichens that clung to life in the harshest conditions. He saw a world that was fighting for its life, a silent, ancient being under assault. He had spent his career building fortresses for a tyrannical empire. Now, he had the chance to build one final thing. Not a wall to keep people out, but a shield to keep a world safe. His past paraded through his mind. The faces of the people on the worlds the empire had crushed. The hollow feeling in his gut after every successful campaign. The slow erosion of his soul until he was nothing but a functionary, a cog in a machine of conquest. He had been running from that man his entire life. Perhaps this was not an end, but a transformation. A way to finally build something that would last, something that would protect rather than oppress. Atonement. He looked at Lyra. Her light was a soft, anxious blue. She was not demanding this of him. She was offering it as the only solution she could see. In her, he saw the embodiment of the world she represented. Powerful, yet vulnerable. Ancient, yet innocent. To let her, and the world she was a part of, be shattered for the sake of the Empire's greed was an obscenity he could no longer abide. The decision settled in his mind, not with a crash, but with a quiet, solemn click, like a final gear locking into place. His purpose, which had been adrift for so long, was suddenly clear, sharp, and absolute. He sat down on the hard ground, his injured leg throbbing with a dull ache. He pulled his datapad from his belt. The screen flickered to life, its sterile green glow a stark contrast to the living light of his companion. His fingers, calloused and sure, began to move across the screen. He was not a philosopher or a martyr. He was an engineer. And if he was going to do this, he was going to do it right. He began to design. He drew upon every bit of knowledge he had. Imperial shield theory, resonance frequency modulation, power conduit architecture, neural interface design. He sketched out a structure, a physical housing for the fusion of their energies. It was not a weapon. It was a resonance chamber, a regulator. It was designed to take the raw, planetary power Lyra could channel and shape it, stabilize it, and project it in a perfectly harmonic, unbreakable shell. The design was complex, elegant, and brutally efficient. It looked, in its simple, functional geometry, like a barn, a place to shelter something precious. He worked for what felt like a lifetime, the tremors in the ground a constant reminder of the ticking clock. When he was finished, the schematic glowed on his screen. It was the best work he had ever done. It was the last work he would ever do. He held the datapad out to Lyra. She floated closer, her crystalline head tilting as she looked at the design. The light within her shifted, the colors deepening. She did not need to understand the technical specifics. She understood the intent. She understood the shape of his sacrifice. She raised a hand and gently touched the screen. Her light flowed into the datapad, and the schematic on the screen flared, its lines of green code and blue diagrams momentarily glowing with an internal, amethyst light. It was her acceptance, her agreement. Then, she looked at him, and for the first time, she communicated a feeling that was purely her own, an emotion that needed no vision to be understood. Her light pulsed with a profound, overwhelming sorrow. It was the grief of a friend for a sacrifice that, while necessary, was still a terrible loss. Kalen gave a small, weary smile. He had made his peace. He stood up, his gaze turning in the direction of Site 734. The core chamber was there, at the bottom of the deepest hole the Empire had ever drilled. They had to go back. They had to return to the heart of the wound to build the cure. The tremors were growing stronger. It was time. The journey back to Site 734 was a desperate race against the clock. The sky was no longer just glowing. It was streaked with incandescent lines as the Imperial fleet began to fire its preliminary ranging shots, superheated lances of energy that vaporized acres of the planet's surface where they struck. The ground shook with a continuous, violent shudder. The world was coming apart. Lyra carried him, her speed a blur of amethyst light against the dying landscape. They flew over plains that were cracking open, revealing fissures that glowed with magma from below. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning rock. It was an apocalyptic vision, the death throes of a planet. They reached the perimeter of the facility. It was in ruins, shattered by the intensifying earthquakes and the initial energy strikes. The remaining Imperial forces were in a state of panicked evacuation, scrambling to get off the planet before it was annihilated. No one paid them any mind. They were a ghost slipping through a graveyard. Lyra led him to the main drilling platform, a vast, circular scar on the landscape, miles wide. In the center was the maw of the drill itself, a gaping, black hole that plunged miles down into the planet's crust. This was the source of the world's pain, and it would be the site of its salvation. They descended into the shaft, a dizzying drop into darkness. Lyra's light illuminated the smooth, laser-cut walls of the borehole. Down and down they went, past geological layers that represented millions of years of history, until they finally emerged into a cavern of unimaginable scale. The core chamber. It was a space so vast that Lyra's light could not touch its ceiling. The air hummed with immense energy. Great, continent-sized crystals grew from the walls, pulsing with a soft, internal light. In the center of the cavern, suspended in a web of gravitational anomalies, was the planet's core, a sphere of pure, white-hot energy that was the heart of Xylos. The tip of the Imperial drill hung just above it, a black, metallic dagger poised to strike. They were not alone. A single figure stood on the narrow service platform that encircled the drill's tip. Lieutenant Bohr. His transport was gone. He had either been left behind or had chosen to stay, a captain determined to go down with his sinking ship. He turned as they landed, his face a mask of insane fury. "Traitor!" he screamed, his voice thin in the immense space. "You came back to die with your pet rock." He raised his assault blaster and opened fire. There was no time for a fight. The entire cavern vibrated with a new, terrifying intensity. A final, massive energy lance from the fleet above was on its way, the killing blow. Kalen ran, ignoring the plasma bolts searing the air around him. He had the schematic burned into his memory. He knew what he needed. "The conduits," he yelled to Lyra. "I need power, and I need raw silicates. From the walls." She understood immediately. While he sprinted for the drill's main control terminal, she flew toward the cavern walls. She plunged her hands into one of the giant, luminous crystals. A wave of energy, raw and untamed, flowed from the wall, through her, and arced across the cavern like lightning, striking the drill's power systems. The dormant machine roared to life, its systems overloading from the surge of alien power. Kalen ripped open the control panel, his hands flying as he bypassed Imperial safeties and rerouted the drill's energy flow. He was not trying to control the drill, he was hijacking its components. He needed its power converters, its magnetic field projectors, its structural frame. He was turning a weapon of destruction into a tool of creation. Bohr charged him, his face contorted with rage. "I will not let you defile this machine with your treason," he bellowed. Before Bohr could reach him, Lyra moved. She did not attack him directly. Instead, she pulled a stream of liquid, molten crystal from the cavern wall and flung it through the air. It did not strike Bohr, but the platform at his feet. The metal instantly cooled and hardened, encasing his legs in a solid block of crystal, trapping him where he stood. He roared in frustration, firing his blaster uselessly at Lyra's shimmering form. Kalen ignored him. He was in a trance of pure engineering. Guided by his instructions, Lyra began to tear components from the drill and the cavern walls, plates of refined alloy, crystalline power conduits, focusing lenses. She brought them to the center of the platform, where Kalen began to assemble them with frantic precision. The structure began to take shape, a skeletal frame of metal and crystal, just as he had designed it on his datapad. His barn was rising. The final component was the neural interface chair, salvaged from the drill's primary control system. He integrated it into the heart of his creation, the final piece of the puzzle. The entire chamber was now shaking so violently it was hard to stand. The killing blow was seconds away. He turned to Lyra. There were no words left to say. He placed a hand on her crystalline shoulder, a brief, final touch. Her light pulsed with that same, profound sorrow. He gave her a single, sharp nod. Then he turned and sat in the chair. He took a deep breath and activated the interface. Needles, cold and sharp, slid from the chair into the base of his skull. His vision exploded into a universe of pure data, of energy flows and geometric patterns. He felt his consciousness expand, untethered from his body. He felt the structure around him, felt Lyra pouring her life force into it, felt the immense, living presence of the planet's core below. He reached out with his mind, no longer just Kalen the engineer, but something more. He took the chaotic, screaming torrent of Lyra's power and he shaped it. He imposed order. He imposed structure. He built the shield. From the outside, the effect was instantaneous. Just as a lance of unimaginable energy pierced the planet's crust, heading for the core, Kalen's structure flared to life. A wave of iridescent, harmonic energy erupted from the core chamber. It surged up the drill shaft, spreading out across the planet in the blink of an eye. It was not a violent explosion, but a perfect, resonant wave. The energy lance struck the new shield and simply dissipated. Its power was not blocked. It was absorbed, harmonized, and rendered inert. In orbit, the Imperial fleet suddenly went dark. Every ship, from the smallest fighter to Valerius's flagship, lost all power. Their weapons, their engines, their life support, all of it was neutralized by the resonant wave. The fleet was now just a collection of cold, silent tombs drifting in space. On the surface, every piece of Imperial technology died. Vehicles ground to a halt. Blasters turned into inert chunks of metal. The drill in the core chamber went silent. Lieutenant Bohr, trapped on the platform, could only stare in disbelief as the lights on his armor and weapon flickered out. And across the entire planet, the shard storms ceased. The wind died down to a gentle breeze. The abrasive dust settled. For the first time in years, a profound, unbroken silence fell over the world of Xylos. The fever had broken. The war was over. In the heart of the world, Kalen, the man, was gone. In his place was a silent, watchful consciousness, the eternal guardian at the heart of the machine. The foundation of the barn held firm. 10 years passed. The fall of the Imperial fleet at Xylos was a mystery that became a legend, a cautionary tale that historians would later point to as the beginning of the Empire's overreach and subsequent collapse. The crippled fleet was eventually discovered, its crews long dead, its technology inert and bafflingly useless. The Empire, weakened by internal strife and the loss of its best fleet, crumbled within a generation. A new galactic accord was formed, founded on principles of cooperation and non-interference. A diplomatic vessel from the new accord descended through the clear, calm skies of Xylos. The planet was now a protected sanctuary, a world left to heal. The envoy, a young historian named Alara, stepped out onto the surface. The air was clean, the light from the twin suns warm and gentle. The ground was no longer gray and cracked, but covered in a soft, moss-like growth that shimmered with faint, crystalline particles. Xylos was alive and thriving. A figure was waiting for them. It was a Xylan, its form a breathtaking sculpture of amethyst and quartz, glowing with a calm, powerful inner light. It was Lyra. She had become the voice and guardian of her world, her consciousness now fully merged with the healed planetary network. She communicated not with visions of pain, but with feelings of peace and welcome, a language of pure empathy the Accord diplomats were just beginning to learn. She led the small party across the rejuvenated landscape, toward a new, singular feature that dominated the horizon. It was a mountain, but a mountain unlike any other. It was a single, massive, crystalline structure that rose from the plains, its facets catching the light of the suns and refracting it into 1,000 rainbows. It was perfectly symmetrical, its lines clean and functional, a monument of impossible, beautiful engineering. It hummed with a soft, quiet energy, a steady, rhythmic pulse like a sleeping heart. This was the site of the old imperial drill. This was the place the Accord called the Xylan anomaly. Alara stood before it, dwarfed by its scale, feeling the deep, resonant peace that emanated from it. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice a whisper in the great silence. Lyra projected a feeling, a story, directly into their minds. It was the story of the Empire's greed, of a world's pain, and of a man. A simple, broken man who had been a builder of cages. They saw him, a fleeting image of a tired face and determined eyes, as he made an impossible choice. They felt his sacrifice, the moment his consciousness had become the eternal, unwavering guardian of the shield that now protected this world. He was not dead, Lyra communicated, but he was no longer a man. He was the foundation. He was the logic that tempered her power. He was the quiet, constant watcher who maintained the balance. He was the soul of the mountain. Others had bragged about surviving death storms. He had built a barn that outlived the Empire. Alara looked up at the silent, crystalline mountain, at this profound memorial to a forgotten hero. His name was lost to history, his face known only to the being who stood beside her. But his legacy was here. It was in the peaceful sky, the calm winds, and the vibrant life of a world reborn. It was a legacy of quiet, unbreakable strength, a testament not to a great battle won, but to a single, selfless act of creation that had brought a lasting, somber peace. The mountain hummed its quiet, endless song, a lonely vigil that would last for eternity.